Hi everyone. Today I am going to be reflecting on this week's readings. Um, this actually this class actually is very near and dear to my heart. I wasn't born in America. I was born in Cuba, and I migrated here when I was 4.5 years old, and I started in kindergarten as a 5-year-old. And my boyfriend's family grew up in Puerto Rico, and then they were transferred to another place due to the army. And his siblings had the same issue I did, where we were in a situation where we had to learn a second language. Our primary language, being Spanish, was no longer of good use to us. So this class itself is very meaningful to me, and to see how to help children that were like me better themselves. In the readings, for example, in the readings of One Child, Two Languages, I thought it was interesting how they mentioned that there are different periods that children go through. There's a period where the children continues using their home language within the classroom, although nobody else will be able to understand. A perfect example of this was, we were discussing this the other day, my boyfriend's sister only knew Spanish, and they were on the playground, and she was telling the kids, ven a jugar conmigo, which is come play with me. And the kids would look at the parents like, what is she saying to me? And she continued to talk to them in Spanish, and there was no vocalization back because they did not understand. Parents had to translate for the children, and then the children went on and played together due to this translation provided by the parents. But if the parents weren't there to help translate, what would have happened in that scenario? Would they have thought she was odd, weird, left her alone, kind of isolated her? Which leads me into the second time period which a child that is learning a new language goes through, and it's the nonverbal period. They just kind of shut down. They don't want to speak in their language in the school setting or in a setting where their native tongue is not used, but they'll still try to communicate non-verbally with cues, holding up a remote, pointing at a question on a paper, just to continue trying to communicate. They just do not want to vocalize their meaning. And then it also states here, children begin to go public using individual words and phrases in the new language. This is when they're actually starting to rehearse, to practice the new language, using, for example, this is a highlighter, and they'll repeat highlighter, and they get the idea that anything that's like this is called a highlighter, not a marker. We're used this to highlight things, and they will continue using that and continue to practice that. And then eventually the children begin to develop productive use of the second language. They begin to use phrases and sentences that they can construct themselves, which is very important at a young age. To actually, if a child's going to be introduced to a new language, the best time to do it is at a young age, as they will be able to also gather the native accent. Myself included, there are some times that you could tell that I have an accent, maybe that I'm Spanish, but that's because of where I grew up, and I grew up in Miami. This is how Miami people talk, and this is our accent. I'm sure if I would have grown up north, I would have had a different accent. But nonetheless, I still have an American accent. If I would talk to you in the street, you would know I'm Hispanic, physically, appearance, but if once I vocalize myself, you will not be able to tell whether I was born here or born out of the country, like in most cases. Then this portion of the child going dilingual, which is when the child just goes nonverbal for a period of time. Dilingual is when the child continues to use their home language regardless if anybody else is using it in the time period. Is interesting to me, because I've seen it happen. I remember being in 5th grade, and kids that were just coming in from a different country, whether it was Cuba, Puerto Rico, Peru, Venezuela, wherever this country was, mainly Hispanic, because I did grow up in a Hispanic neighborhood, I guess you could say. I could see them talking to kids that were full-blown American, no understanding of Spanish except hola, like that. and they would still talk to them in Spanish. They will try to have a full conversation with this person in Spanish, and the person would just stare at them blankly, which leads me to a portion that was actually mentioned within the book, that children actually eventually kind of not talk down to the other children, but they do kind of talk in a different tone of voice. They'll talk to the child that does not speak, in this case, English. They'll talk to them as if they were an infant. They'll slow down their speech, use very, very simple words, and they'll go into a higher pitched voice. For example, hi, my name is Cindy. That's things that they will do, and the child's not trying to be insulting to the child that does not speak English, for example. They're just trying to be sensitive to the situation and acknowledge the fact that this other child does not speak their native tongue, and they're trying to get them to understand and communicate regardless of the situation with this other child. Like I mentioned before, the nonverbal time period, some children do close off in a way which they do not want to interact with other children. They'll isolate themselves. But as mentioned in the readings, it is not something that happens often, but it could happen. But most of the time what children actually do, like I mentioned previously, they shut down verbally, but they'll still communicate with you physically. They'll be expressive, they will point, they will pick up items to try and figure out what it is, or what its name is in the new language, the second language that they're trying to learn. They will, in these situations, what I've heard is to completely only talk to the child in the new language, not to provide them a bilingual setting. But that's kind of difficult when the child does not understand what you're telling them. You're just going to confuse the child. So there does have to be a happy medium when it comes to this topic. It's sensitive because if you completely remove the child's native tongue, the first language that they learned, they might completely shut down on the new language. You need to be very open with them and show them that, okay, this is your native language, this is your first language learned, but here's a new one. Here's how you use it. And that's why they have ELS classes, English language learners classes, that sometimes the child will be completely immersed in an English setting for the majority of the day, but then for an hour or two during that day, they will be pulled from their regular classes and taken into another class with a teacher that does speak fluent Spanish, and they'll be taught basic verbs, not pronouns, adjectives, and things like that, and how to properly construct a sentence. And obviously, most of these kids will start with the basics like we do in kindergarten. They will start with cat, hat, bat. They'll rhyme simple words like that. That's other kids, probably, let's say in the 4th grade, would be like, wow, why are you learning 3-letter words? But these kids have to start from scratch. They have to start from the beginning, just like we did when they're learning a new language. And they actually go into what was I going to mention? I'm so sorry. It refers to, and then they actually spectate. There's the spectators. They watch what other children are doing. They listen to what other children are doing, and then they start rehearsing. This is when you start noticing the change from going nonverbal to actually starting to communicate. They will start repeating words. They will start repeating phrases like, how are you? They'll start trying to say, how are you? And they'll use it whenever they can. They're also instructed to do this by the teachers, because this could form communication. This forms an open pathway between students to be able to communicate, and it will eventually help the child that does not know the second language to use it, and how to use it, and when to use it. And then eventually they start making their own phrases, their own sentences, And like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, they will vocalize it, and if they're young enough, they will end up with a native accent. Um, there are several different theories in regards to this second language and how to learn it, and how children are able to capture it so quickly. I believe personally that the two that stood out the most to me from the readings was the social interaction theory, which it's an approach that proposes that children acquire language through close interaction with adults and older children, and that structure of language arises out of the social and communicative functions of language. Basically, imitating. They imitate what they see, they vocalize, they imitate vocalizations, and that's how they develop their language, through the social interaction, which is exactly what I've been saying this whole time in English language learners classes. What do? They imitate, they learn from other people, and then they actually make this second language a new language for them. Another one that kind of stood out to me was the cognitive theory. And this theory views language as a general ability that emerges within context of other general cognitive abilities like memory, attention, and problem solving. Babies are born with no understanding of our language, regardless of the language, English, Spanish, Dutch, doesn't matter. But then they start babbling, they start making sounds, and then slowly they start trying to make sounds like we do. They'll start with mama, papa, things that we constantly say to them. They'll start trying to say it back, and then eventually they create a meaning from it, which is why I believe this theory also goes hand in hand with how we learn language, because it is something that eventually merges, that comes from us when we are born. So I think that's something very important to keep keep your mind on when teaching children that do not know a language. You have to realize that this is something new to them. They're going to start from scratch like many of us did many years ago. And then pretty much that's my views on the readings for this week. I think this is a great way to understand children that are learning a second language. This is extremely useful. It even makes me understand, because I did go through a period where I just completely shut down. I did not want to learn the new language. I did not want to know anything about it. I hated school. I remember I would tell my mom, can we just go back home? I don't want to be here. I don't belong here. And then I started getting the language, I started understanding it, and then here I am today. So this kind of opened my eyes and made me see that period that I went through when I was younger was a normal stage. Although to people that are not educated in this and are not aware of this, may think that I was having a bad time, I was being bullied or something along those lines, and I wasn't. It was just a stage that I simply had to go through. And I feel that knowing this now will definitely help me be a better educator, be a better instructor when I do have children that are learning English as a second language, which will happen regardless of the state you're in. This is something that will happen due to the mass migrations that are happening nowadays, and so many people coming from other countries and are trying to basically just look for a better life for their children, and their children are being put into schools where they have to learn this new language, and some of them might react differently than others, but knowing this is definitely helpful to me as an instructor, to be able to better teach them and better help them understand what they're going through. And I think even my personal experiences will help me help them. But yeah, those are my thoughts and opinions. I hope I didn't insult anybody during those thoughts and opinions. But bye everybody. Thank you.